Hello, Grace, and welcome back to Cover to Cover. Today's reading is Isaiah 52:12, all the way to the end of Isaiah 57. Our reading today begins with a passage that, since the time of the New Testament, Christians have quoted as prophetic of Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection. That is the servant song of Isaiah 52-53. Where it says, "He was wounded for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." We'll focus a bit on this, but first it will be helpful to take a step back and look at the bigger picture of what's going on in Isaiah. As Pastor Steve noted in his presentation, Isaiah 40 through 66 is prophetic. Isaiah lived in the 700s BC, and chapters 40 through 66 span a period of over 100 years after Isaiah's death. My professors at school said it's helpful to look at the book of Isaiah in terms of three different epochs of time. The first is the period in which Isaiah lived, and that is covered in chapters 1 through 39. The second part, chapters 45 through 55, or 40 through 55, seem to concern the period of the exile. They include the prophecy that Pastor Steve mentioned where Cyrus the Great is mentioned by name. The nation is in exile, and Isaiah promises they will return to the land of Israel. The final section, chapters 56 through 66, seem to address the nation after the exile, when many have returned to the land. Our reading today sits on the cusp of the second and third thematic arc of this book. And one thing is clear, in each of the three sections of the book, the people seem to be inclined towards idolatry. In the book of Isaiah, idolatry is not just failure to worship, it's not attending a non-Christian place of worship, but it ultimately leads to various forms of injustice. Isaiah chapters 1 through 5 link idolatry to greed and state explicitly that the poor, the orphan, and the widow suffer because of the greed of Israel's rulers. God does not want their sacrifices, and their church attendance is despicable to them. If you recall Brother Nate's lesson on Micah 6, the prophet specifically states that church attendance and sacrifice are not substitutes for acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly. As we approach Isaiah 39 and move into the second thematic arc, the discussion of idolatry is extended to include putting faith in armies and fortresses and alliances. Assyria attacked Israel because Israel formed a coalition to oppose them. And in a theme we see continuously throughout the Bible, from Exodus to Hezekiah, God delivers Israel against all odds, odds that would be insurmountable in any other situation. And that leads us to our reading today. If you recall, Isaiah prophesied the eventual fall of the kingdom of Judah after Hezekiah welcomed the Babylonian envoys. Even after being delivered from Assyria, Hezekiah, one of Israel's good kings, failed to trust completely in God. Israel is in exile, in our section for today's reading. Israel is in exile, and our reading begins with the last of four songs, four servant songs, and this one is oftentimes referred to as the suffering servant song. The section from 40 through 55 begins with the words, "Comfort, O comfort my people," and we're to understand this section as a message of hope and comfort. The return from exile is foretold, but Israel's deliverer is portrayed as a suffering servant. It says, like a lamb being led to slaughter. Paradoxically, this servant song begins and ends with a promise of exaltation. It opens with a statement, "My servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted." And then it concludes, "He will divide the spoils with the strong because he poured out his life unto death." The offense of the gospel, which Paul speaks so much about in the New Testament, is that God is shown to be strong when we are weak. For 2,000 years, Christians and Jews have argued over whether this speaks of Jesus or more broadly about Israel or an ideal Israel or a faithful remnant from Israel. And we see the first sign of this debate in Acts chapter 8, when Philip talks with an Ethiopian eunuch. And the eunuch asks him, "Is the prophet speaking of himself or someone else?" Though many of us are familiar with the story in Acts 8, I lost count of how many times I've heard sermons on Acts 8 and the Ethiopian eunuch. But the most detailed exegesis of the servant song in the New Testament comes in 1 Peter chapter 2. And so I'll read verses 21 through 25. Peter says, "Indeed, this is what you were called to, because the Messiah too suffered on your behalf, leaving an example so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, nor was any deceit found on his lips. When he was insulted, he didn't retaliate with insults. When he suffered, he didn't threaten, but handed them over to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the stake, and so we might die to sin and live for righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. For you used to be like sheep gone astray, but now you have turned to the shepherd who watches over you." And so Peter tells us that when Jesus assumed the role of the suffering servant, we were invited to participate in his sufferings as the example that we were to follow. Finally, chapters 56 through 57, the return to the land after exile is not going as perfect as the people expected. So here we are in like the third epoch of the book of Isaiah. And as we'll see in later lessons, this final section looks forward to a more distant future when the people will be ruled by God's Davidic king. In chapter 56, this future blessing of God is promised, but Israel's leaders continue to be corrupt. In chapter 57, idolatry is again condemned. Even after exile and return, the people of Israel fall into the snare of idol worship. And this causes injustice for the poor, the widow, and the orphan, and they trust other gods to save them. This chapter concludes with a promise of deliverance for the repentant. No matter how great the sin, God is always ready to welcome his children home.